It is a vast holding. Please, if you will, on the portico, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. You've walked my feet off this morning. Delighted the place to sit.
Well, I hope that you welcome. Oh, good heavens! I dare say, Mr. Adams, our friends here who have come to greet us.
Wasn't where you had neighbors.
Well, I have many, I dare say, certainly many over our 5,000 acres of the 5 farms I've inherited. But I think you're realizing this is the most historically unrecorded moment in our nation's history, that Mr. Adams and I may be here at El Monticello particularly to greet you, and, well, perhaps a conversation betwixt us.
History will never record that I was here, and that is as I would have it.
Well, by your own admittance, Mr. Adams. But I wish you to know that we have a good friend of ours here today, Ms. Alice Wagner, who will engage questions of our friends here betwixt us, and perhaps in recognition of well, the presidential election of 1800. Might that be interesting to you?
Oh, yes, indeed. I just love to talk about the election of 1800.
Yeah. Well, firstly, if you will, you've been kind to abide by the laws of our Commonwealth. But in order that we might be heard more distinctly, will you allow us to remove our mask? Very well. Thank you. Yeah, that's better, is it not?
I suppose.
Now, may I take a chair?
Of course.
Thank you. Well, Ms. Wagner, I'm very curious as to what might be your first question to us here this day.
Well, gentlemen, what do you recall about meeting each other and about working together on the committee to draft the Declaration of Independence?
When I met Jefferson, the first thing I thought was, he is tall. In fact, he was very lanky. In fact, he didn't sit into a chair so much as fold into it. But I am quite different from Mr. Jefferson, which we are now aware of, but not at the time. I love to argue. Argument is a form of sport with me. I love to present my opinions boldly and expect others to present theirs to me in return. That this is a way that the mind might be stretched, to have your ideas challenged, and to challenge others without causing offense and without being offended. Jefferson never argues. Never. In fact, I thought he completely agreed with everything I said, which led me to my initial conclusion that he was very intelligent indeed.
Well, I thank you, Mr. Adams, for the compliment, but I will tell you that Mr. Adams' admittance of his particular talent for argumentation was already to make him renowned before we met. In fact, I heard and read about your extraordinary defense of the British soldiers there at what has become known as the Boston Massacre. That was March of 70, was it not?
British subject, and today the right of every Englishman to have competent defense when charged with felony.
Well, you were most successful, Mr. Adams, most successful. So that when we first met, and that was the spring of 75 in Philadelphia City, well, I was very prone to...
You arrived in May, as I recall.
I did arrive in May, and I was quite prone to get to know you. You were already highly esteemed throughout the colonies. Your next question, Ms. Wagner.
Mr. Adams, what part did you play in the negotiations at the final signing of the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Revolutionary War?
Oh, what is my finest contribution? Well, I was in the minority initially. Mr. Franklin, Mr. Jay objected to the idea that Americans should still have to pay debts to English merchants that were incurred before the war. And I insisted that a debt made in good faith should be paid in good faith. In that I was in the minority, but indeed I confronted the British negotiators over the issue of fishing rights on the Grand Banks. The commissioners for Great Britain insisted on phrasing it as the United States having the liberty to fish upon the Grand Banks, which caused me great offense because it was not theirs to grant us the liberty to do anything, but rather a right.
You both were serving your new country as emissaries to France and England. You took some time to travel together to the Midlands of England. What was your purpose for doing so, and what do you remember most?
What a wonderful time it was, your lady, Abigail, yourself, me, to travel to the Midlands. We had a wonderful, well, how long was it? Was it about 2-3 weeks?
Yeah, we ended in Birmingham.
Yes, we did.
And we went up the Thames initially and exploring the new modern method of gardening. Not at all like they have in France, or indeed the way they had in most in England in the more ancient gardens, or even in this country, the idea of things being laid out and squared off and geometrically presented. The new modern form of gardening is really to create a park-like scene.
Well, there you are, Mr. Adams. Here you see it. I'll put it.
It's very much like it was, absolutely. But what impressed me the most, we visited the battlefield of Edge Hill.
Yes.
Edge Hill, where the seed of liberty was planted during the English Civil Wars. And I was amazed and somewhat disappointed that the people thereabout were completely unimpressed with what they had and where they were. I said, do you not realize what happened here? And that was that and visiting Mr. Shakespeare's home. I've always been a great admirer of Shakespeare, as have you.
I have always been a great admirer of the great bard, and you may recall that when our carriage pulled into the market square, I was the first to alight, and I jumped down upon the ground and kissed it.
I hope I'm not revealing something I ought not, but Mr. Jefferson here actually carved a bit of wood from William Shakespeare's chair.
Now, Mr. Adams, I was not sole in that attempt. I believe you too.
I most certainly did not.
You snitched a piece of the chair that they told us he passed away in. Yes, I do remember it distinctly.
I have no recollection of that.
Yes.
Perhaps I picked something up off the floor.
The reason for this particular journey through the Midlands was simply because Mr. Adams had written me. At that time, you were Minister Plenipotentiary at the court of George III. And you wrote me that there would be the opportunity for a number of ambassadors of European kingdoms to be in London at the same time, and that I should sail over the Channel and be there with you to negotiate treaties of trade. It would be most opportune. Well, as you know, the monarchy, the British monarchy, discovered that was our intention as well. So they did the best to keep us away from that group of ambassadors. Your next question, Miss Way.
Can you both discuss your stances on slavery and abolition?
Well, I think my stance on slavery is well known. I wrote a constitution for Massachusetts in 1776, though it was not actually adopted by Massachusetts, the Commonwealth, until 1780. But it, of course, was the phrase, all men are created equal and free, which was actually borrowed from the Virginia Constitution. And there was actually a committee that put that in there. Massachusetts was the first colony to legalize slavery in 1641. And it was because of judicial review that it was abolished. There was a lawsuit, a Quock Watkins versus Jennison, in which the Quock Watkins was a slave suing for his freedom, and the judge, upon consulting the Massachusetts Constitution, upon reading it literally, as one might do, said, there is no slavery in Massachusetts. And so that's essentially what ended it. But we never actually did away with it by statute. It had been created by statute. It had been eliminated by judicial review. I don't know what kind of difficulty they would have with that in Virginia. Virginia is an interesting paradox. Virginia doesn't legalize slavery until 1662.
I try to make no excuses for this, but Mr. Adams knows well that we continue to be bound in our new Commonwealth by ancient laws, but more than that, we're bound by habit and custom, a constant contradiction, and I am hopeful that we might rectify this before my maker calls me on, but I doubt I'm going to live to see it. And I can certainly not make any further excuse, can I, Mr. Adams, when you see surrounding us everything that makes this entire plantation successful, or let alone our Commonwealth and our nation. history is going to be harsh upon us. Will you agree?
Well, no, not necessarily. I mean, consider the rationale behind it. Yes, harsh indeed they ought to be, but I mean, the difficulty is your entire society, not just this plantation, is built upon the foundation of slavery. That's why your public servants are not compensated for their time in government, because they have slaves, which give them the leisure time to serve the community without compensation. In Massachusetts, our society was not built on that foundation. And the great paradox is that the people coming to Virginia from Africa in 1619 were slaves of the Dutch. And by coming to Virginia, their freedom was guaranteed. Isn't that a wonderful paradox? Because slavery does not exist in common law. It had to be invented by statute. These Africans, their freedom was purchased by the Virginia Company of London, which in reciprocity, they did work for the Virginia Company of London for a period of time under indenture, and then were granted land. And many of them became wealthy farmers and planters. But then in 1662, the slave codes turned that around. In 1705, the slave codes are further changed in that now you could not free your slaves without a writ of manumation, whereas before you could. But the difficulty was, as soon as you're too old to work, it's, well, you're free. Best of luck to you. So it is a horrible paradox, and I don't know what the remedy might be. I cannot imagine overnight abolition. It's not practicable, though I would wish it to be so.
I would wish it to be as well, Mr. Adams, but as I mentioned, I doubt I'm going to live to see it, and I can provide no further excuses.
Perhaps you ought to, as did, what was the fellow in Williamsburg? Carter?
Oh, Robert Carter.
Yeah, perhaps you might employ your people. Perhaps you might divvy up your plantation amongst the many enslaved families that you have living here. Would that not be an equitable solution?
And, Mr. Adams, you know that Dr. Carter, Robert Carter, was one of the wealthiest men in all of Virginia. He could afford to manumit his people, which he was able to do over a period of 3 years. I am very heavily in debt.
Oh, are you? And whose fault is that? Sorry, forgive me.
Ms. Wagner, your next question, please.
When General Washington refused a third term as president in 1796, what led the two of you to become rivals in the presidential election of 1796?
Well, I dare say, Mr. Adams, we realized at that point, 96, that politics, just like nature, abhors a vacuum. By then, all of the factions that had accrued in our federal government began to implode, did they not? And those who had become known as Federalists, and I mind you that that was considered a faction before there was ever an opposition to it, well, the Federalists believed whoever was vice president should quite naturally.
And then the Republican faction was created, thereby creating political parties, which is a great evil that promises to do our republic ultimately great injury.
I beg your pardon, you heard me distinctly, did you not, state that those who had become known as Federalists, particularly with their strong ties and connections to the counting houses.
To the Federalist Constitution, Jefferson.
Oh, indeed. I've always been a believer and a supporter of a federal constitution.
And then the Republicans, to justify their existence, falsely accused the Federalists of being monarchists, me in particular, and that we were going to return to the king, and that our citizens would be returned to a state of slavery to the crown.
Mr. Adams,
Therefore, they call themselves the Republicans because they advocate a republic.
Gentlemen, please.
I'm afraid, citizens, that you might hereby understand why Vice President Adams and myself then began to fall into contention. That first public presidential election, you cannot deny that General Washington could have been president for life.
Till he died. Absolutely, and that probably would have been a great advantage to us all. But no, he saw 2 terms.
Never forget, he gave up the power of lofty office to retire under his own vine and fig. And yes, then we were on our own. We had to decide whether election of, by, and for the people can continue and not hope to fall back on the tenets and charges of monarchy and nobility, aristocracy, landed gentry, special privilege. Ms. Wagner.
Mr. Jefferson, it appears you were somewhat less than loyal to President Adams as his vice president. Will you explain why?
Citizens, I hope you do not forget that our Constitution, for the stronger and more central federal government, actually states whoever receives the second highest number of votes becomes vice president. Now, I declare, if there were ever a fault in our Constitution, that is certainly obvious, is it not? And so therefore, as a result of that presidential election of 96, I, receiving the second highest number of votes, will not deny I succumbed to Vice President Adams. And yes, I was your vice president for 4 years, but you know that I was not a silent vice president. Simply because I succumbed, simply because we followed the Constitution.
No, you hired
as it was
newspaper
written.
publishers to spread your libel.
I beg your pardon, you were not without
You
your
weren't
publishers as
silent at
well.
all. No, indeed, I was not, sir.
Newspapers were rife with your heresies
Oh,
and
there were.
accusations.
I was
hurled
not
against
publishing
me.
them. Well, they should have been against you. The question was, why were you disloyal to? Oh, I see. No, I think you answered the question. Your loyalty is to your party, not to the Republic.
I beg your pardon, my loyalty is to the American people.
Oh,
And so it was. We continued to disagree, disagreeing over the treatment of our former ally, France, did we not? Disagreement over the growing deficit in our national government. Disagreement over the idea of a national bank. Now, there we are, Mr. Adams. I know your opinion is not too lofty of former Secretary of the Treasury General Hamilton, but where in our Constitution does it make any statement for the necessity of a national bank?
Where is it in the Constitution that says we cannot create a national bank?
Oh, you're standing upon inference.
Well, so are you.
No, I'm not. I'm standing upon fact of the matter. You're trying to twistify the fact. No, you can see.
So I see.
You see, Ms. Wagner,
no doubt
and
if-
citizens as well, that I was not a silent vice president.
So where in the Constitution does it say a state cannot secede from the Union? Therefore, you advocate
What are
secession?
you talking about, Adams? That has nothing
says
to
there's
do with
nothing
the
about the
election
bank.
of 96, nor does it have anything to do with the election of 1800.
I don't want to talk about the election of 1800.
I dare say there were those, were they not, up in New England who suggested that it is time for New England to secede from the Union. Now explain that one.
No, I agree. And where in the Constitution does it say that they cannot? That they should not is one thing. Does it say that they cannot? You say it doesn't say in the Constitution anything about having a national bank, therefore they can't create one?
Ms. Wagner, do you have another question for
I'm
us
waiting
here?
to hear why you were disloyal to.
I beg your pardon, Mr. Adams. This is such a lovely day. Where do you find such a day like this in Massachusetts?
Well, I'm afraid, Mr. Adams, we do have a great deal of interest in the election of 1800.
I thought
Can you
so.
elaborate what your respective campaign strategies were for that election?
I had no campaign
strategies?
strategies. I did not have any campaign
Good
strategies.
Lord, Ms. Wagner, you're making it seem as if Mr. Adams' particular faction, the Federalists,
I did not actively seek the office of President of the United States. We did not campaign. Jefferson did, but I did not
I
campaign.
beg your pardon, you're
Jefferson
making it seem
campaigned
like a
through his
military
newspapers.
effort with all
Jefferson
sorts of
sought the
reconnaissance
office
and
of president. I thought the fact that I'd had a successful 4 years and kept America out of war would speak for itself, but I did not actively campaign or seek the office of president in the manner in which you speak. I had no stratagem for doing so.
Ms. Wagner and citizens, nor did I actively campaign as if it was some sort of military strategy to seek that high office. In fact, Mr. Adams, you know well that we kept generally silent. It was the state legislatures that were wont to, argue and debate as they should in order to finally cast their votes, and not to deny the voice of the people, well, at least the voice of the white male freeholder, 21 years of age or older, to cast their particular votes. But by that time, by 1800, you cannot deny, Mr. Adams, our nation was greatly divided. And you were referring to the news writers. They were rife with heresies and accusations hurled against all of the candidates. And Mr. Adams and I were not alone. You remember that? Your particular platform invited the hero of the Revolution from South Carolina, General Pinckney, to stand with you on the Federalist platform. And I'm not going to deny that former Federalist from New York, Burr Adams, who visited here at Monticello back in, it was about 97. I wrote to my daughter, he left before dinner because of a difference of opinion. But he was invited to stand on my platform, the anti-federalist or Democratic or Republican platform. And those newspapers took advantage. I believe that, was it not Fenno, John Fenno, his Gazette of the United States, for which you wrote columns, casting aspersions at me, was rife with deceits.
That is not true at all.
It is true. And then happily, the anti-federalist platform, the Democratic Republicans welcome Mr. Philip Freneau. Philip Freneau's National Gazette was wont to print the truth. Benjamin Franklin Base's Aurora printed the truth. Mr. William Duane of Philadelphia was wont to encourage the enlightenment of the people, exposing the fact of the matter, and thereby hoping to deny those heresies that your particular administration was hurling against me.
I'm not familiar with the term Democratical Republicans. Are you trying to start yet another party?
I beg your pardon, Mr. Adams. You know well of what I'm referring to, but rest you assured, we survived that presidential election in 1800, and would you deny, Mr. Adams, thank heaven there will be nothing ever like it again in our nation's history.
I hope, I pray not.
Ms. Wagner.
Mr. Adams, why did you not attend President Jefferson's inauguration?
The stage left at 4 o'clock in the morning?
You could have caught him later stage.
Yes, in the evening. I wouldn't have gotten to Baltimore until the next day, for God's sakes.
Well,
No,
why wouldn't you not have waited another day? You could have taken the stagecoach early the next
day
morning.
was yours. You won, fair and square. I'll allow it, because we're amongst civil people. But the day was yours. I could not imagine it. Can you imagine? If I had stayed for your inauguration, people would have accused me, especially in your Republican newspapers, that I was there attempting to steal your thunder. And I certainly didn't want that accusation hurled at myself. And yes, the simple answer is the stage left at 4 in the morning. I wanted to go home. My public service was concluded.
I will rest.
And yet they get controversy out of that. That's what I mean. There's controversy because I left for the first stage of the day at 4 in the morning. I was thrown out of office, and all I wanted to do was go home.
Please, Mr.
How
Adams.
is that sinister?
I didn't even suggest it was sinister. I simply had a question about it, and please do not think you were thrown out of office. I did secede you, but it was not until after quite a wrestle. I will tell you that. You may recall that though the popular vote took some time to finally arrive in Washington City, and remember, any presidential election could not possibly be decided in one day. We live in a 4-mile-an-hour world, so all of the votes began in the late spring, as they did in 96 and then in 1800, and continued through the year, and then were finally received in Washington City at the beginning of the next year, '01. And then, I can never forget it, Mr. Adams, hardly a laughing matter, but it was the first week in February, 1801, when I presided before the Senate, one of my duties, probably the only duty as vice president, and opened the electoral votes. And there, as one of the candidates, I had to expose not a victory, but a tie in the electoral votes. Upwards, I believe, 73 electoral votes each for Aaron Burr and myself. And for many days, our nation
received 65.
Pardon me?
I received 65.
So you received 60. Well, Jay received
I
one.
almost had it.
Yes, well, and so for many days we had to welcome the election to go into the House, as is noted in our Constitution, and their caucuses were formed, and they voted to break that tie, and they voted, and they voted, and they voted, and voted. Mr. Adams, I believe, did they not vote upwards of about 33 times before they simply stopped a significant number,
That's
33.
because I suspect a lot of them were Masons.
Well, I have nothing to state upon the subject, but there was a rectifying, and I think you recall who it was that suggested a compromise. It was our former Secretary of the Treasury.
Hamilton.
Hamilton, indeed. And so, with that compromise, 3 ballots later, the 36th ballot, it was the 17th of February, 1801, the tie was broken.
I have some things to say about Hamilton. Are their children Oh, never mind.
But I will tell you one thing, citizens. Perhaps one of the reasons Mr. Adams took the first stage out of Washington City the morning of March the 4th, 1801, is because of the Federalist action in our Congress to promote the Federal Judiciary Act of 1801, creating 16 new federal judicial districts for all our 16 states at the time, and then I have realized after the years that they did impose upon you, Mr. Adams. They imposed upon you to appoint judges of the Federalist political opinion to these new benches. Now, I declare...
And those vacancies have been there for a year.
I beg your pardon.
Sorry.
Can you imagine our nation appointing judges to the highest benches based solely upon political opinion? Now, I'm going to ask you, Adams, is that justice?
Can you imagine anything in our government being accomplished simply to support political opinion? As I've always said, political parties are a great evil, and they threaten the existence of our republic. Political parties exist to justify their existence, not the nation's existence. To gain public office, national office, you must first be loyal to the party for them to adopt you and to choose you, that they might support your run for public office. The party is more important, whether you support the party or the country. If you choose the country, the party will not support you. And I suffered that personally.
Mr. Adams, are we then to suggest that the people not engage their liberty to hold an opinion freely and to freely express their opinion?
Jefferson, you can have faction without party. You cannot have party without faction, but you can have faction without party. We had several factions in Congress back in 75 and 76, as you recall. We had no political parties. Can you imagine if we had political parties in 1775, when we required unanimity to declare independence, we would still be British subjects today?
Citizens, I would like to bring something to Mr. Adams' mind that I certainly cannot forget. Ms. Wagner, will you allow me just a moment more in answer to, well, this lengthy answer to your very simple question?
Are we still about why I left before your inauguration?
No, Mr. Adams, I want to remind you of an occasion before you left, an occasion before the election of 1800 was decided in the Congress. Do you remember that I came to visit you in the President's house? It was not yet completed. I remember that I walked up the South Lawn, which was virtually a marsh at that time. There was
and stumps?
A wooden, yes, all over. There was a wooden platform that I took and came up there to the wooden, well, it was somewhat of a balcony, and I walked up there to the first floor, the formal rooms. And I made a rap on the door, and you were the one to open it, and you received me in my fashion with a hand clasp. Well, I was taken at that very moment. Remember, we went in and we sat down and we had a lengthy conversation, sir, and you know the conclusion that we then approached, that the two of us were but victims of political schism, that two others could have been standing in our shoes as well and fallen victim accordingly, that no difference of opinion in either religion or politics should come between true friends. If it does, then there's never been a friendship to begin with. Remember, we parted as friends.
I remember the walls, the plaster was not yet dry. The rooms were cold because we could not find sufficient wood to keep all the fireplaces lit. Yes, but we were warmed by the affection we enjoyed one for the other.
Thank you, Mr. Adams.
Well, on that topic, gentlemen, a couple of our audience members, Robert and Bridget, would like to know, how did you manage to reconcile after all these years?
Oh,
That'd be Dr. Rush.
Dr. Rush. Dr. Rush, I can think not of another.
Dr. Rush communicated with both of us by post. And we returned our correspondence to Rush. And he was the one who brought us back together again in a fashion.
Dr. Benjamin Rush was a Pennsylvania delegate during our Continental Congress as a signer of our Declaration of American Independence, a mutual friend from the very beginning. And Dr. Rush continued in correspondence with us after that election of 1800. And I cannot think of another who promoted us reconvening in at least a correspondence. And, well, I'm not going to deny, Mr. Adams, that reconvening in correspondence took some time. I knew during those 8 years that I served as our nation's chief magistrate that I should not hear from you. And after I handed the gavel to Mr. Madison, I came home and I wondered who should be the first. Dr. Rush suggested that to both you and myself, and I find it of great fortune, citizen, never to forget that in January of 1812, 3 years after I came home, I received a letter from you right here. It began, "My dear Mr. Jefferson," and it reminded me of when the two of us rode together at the same oar to ride out the storm and to make a happy port. You know that I was quick to take up the pen, reply.
Gentlemen, what are your hopes for the future of our nation?
I would hope that the course we have set it on will be continued. The Constitution should not let us down. It is the tiller by which the ship is steered. And indeed, if the Constitution be adhered to and honored, I cannot imagine storms that might rise upon the horizon. Although there have been storms in the past that I have not imagined, but the question was regarding my hopes for the future. And that is my hopes and my prayers.
Mr. Adams, no one could be in a disagreement with you. Of all of those we have known and many who have now fallen by the wayside for what we were able to achieve. To realize, as you have brought up the idea of faction and party, that there's only one true party of our nation, and that is simply the spirit of '76. I will never forget our collaborations on drafting, if you will, what General Washington referred to as our promise, the promise for our nation, our Declaration of American Independence. We were two of the committee of 5 that worked on it, and the two of us, indeed, considering Dr. Franklin in so many ways our mentor. I know, Mr. Adams, that we have disagreed in elements of politics and faction, yes, but truly merely politics, that's all it is, merely politics. And to realize that as Americans, a difference of opinion ought never be a difference of principle, that we remain allied upon our founding principles, to see them forward. And to realize that in politics, what can be said, but they are as natural in the political world as storm and tempest are in the physical. And we will ever see a new dawn, a new fresh ray of light amongst us. And
as Americans, we should look at each other and say, I do not agree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Voltaire.
Wish I had written it.
Yes, well, you probably will.
Mr. Adams, what a pleasure. A decided pleasure to have you here at our Monticello. Please consider this yours. And I would like now, if you are still of an interest, to walk about and show you how your dear lady has been of interest to me. I have planted some of the squill. Do you remember? She brought that back from England. And
you have it here. You planted it here.
Well, it's not up yet. Oh, yes, it's planted. It'll pop up as we welcome the spring. And then a Rosa alba. Do you remember the two of us, supporters of the Duke of York? Indeed, what a valiant individual at that Battle of Bosworth. Remember, we walked there as well.
Yes, we did.
And both of us acquired a white rose. I hope mine will last, Mr. Adams. I believe your lady planted one in your garden at Peacefield. I should be so fortunate someday to see that.
Well, I am duly refreshed. Let us continue our perambulation.
I look forward to it. Citizens, what a pleasure you could greet us. And Ms. Alice Wagner, thank you again for engaging the questions of our citizen body. It's always a pleasure in your company. And will citizens rest you assured that I know Mr. Adams and I remain your humble and obedient servant.
Jefferson.
Adams.